Welcome to Asian Times TV, the show that brings you cutting-edge news and analysis from the Asia-Pacific region as it impacts the United States. We have with us today a very special guest, Maya Soetoro-Ng, President Obama's baby sister. She was born Maya Cassandra Soetoro in a Catholic hospital in Jakarta, Indonesia, to Indonesian businessman Lolo Soetoro and an American cultural anthropologist, Ann Dunham. Her elder brother is the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama. She has said she was named after the American poet Maya Angelou. Maya and Barack spent several years together in Indonesia and in Hawaii before her mother decided to return to Indonesia with her. This is something that I've explored in my book, Barack Obama and Hawaii, Indonesia, quite extensively. And Maya was gracious enough to give me lots of interviews for the book. So I'm happy to have her here. Welcome her to Asian Times TV, which is part of Princeton TV, by the way. So Maya and Barack grew up together and were raised as one family unit, something, I've looked at in detail. So Maya, welcome to Asian Times TV.
Thank you very much for having me.
I appreciate you joining us today. And of course, you're a familiar voice and face in Princeton, given you gave another interview before for my book launch in November last year. But yes. I should interject, though, and state that of course, you're somebody who holds 2 master's degrees and a PhD in education, and you are teaching at the University of Hawaii, and you're also associated with the East-West Center in Honolulu, where actually your parents met many years ago.
They did meet here. They met because my father was at the East-West Center, and he was studying geology, geography, and cartography, from what I understand, and he was an East-West Center fellow. My mother, our mother, in later years also became an East-West fellow, and that was, of course, part of her commitment to connection and collaboration between worlds.
So let me ask you about Indonesia, given it's been in the news, right, recently, because of some of the strife related to this anti-Islamic film that's been circulating in the Islamic world. And apparently today, the news was that the U.S. consulate had been closed down briefly due to anti-American protests. You were just there recently in Indonesia, just I think a few weeks ago or maybe a month ago, approximately. Is that right? Yeah.
Actually, it was in June, so a little longer than that, but yes, recently.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. So given you were there just recently, what do you think is going on? Can you comment on this? Without obviously touching on stuff that's controversial or confidential or stuff that you can't say anything on.
Well, I mean, I think that this is another opportunity for us to take a look at how we can do a better job of respecting one another and planting the seeds of peace between worlds and faiths and all of that. I obviously, I mourn the tragedies in the world related to this. I'm of the feeling that nothing justifies violence. That being said, I would like us to, of course, think about moving forward in such a way that allows us to be brokers of understanding and goodwill across the region. And my hope is that the violence in every part of the world abates, and certainly that we can quickly put a stop to the most recent incidents.
Right. Now, of course, the tragedy, speaking of course, the 4 Americans, including the ambassador that was killed in Libya, at the consulate in Benghazi,
yes.
As kind of a blowback, I guess, partly to all of the changes that have been taking place in that part of the world. But Indonesia is one of the most tolerant and U.S.-friendly nations, so I was a bit surprised and taken aback myself.
Well, it's a big country, and there are people of many minds, and of course there are people who are going to be expressing themselves positively and negatively surrounding this issue, and in a variety of ways. And we want to try to mitigate the violent expressions and increase the democratic and peaceful expressions of protest or feeling. But there, in a country as large as Indonesia, there are, of course, going to be people who are upset.
But it's a
Even
small
though
minority, though, right? It's a small fraction, small minority of the people who are.
Indonesia is, in my experience, as you said, a country that makes room for diversity and tolerance, and that allows for ample exchange and variety of opinion, and where civil Islam governs with no attempt to sort of define Islam in any single way, and allows for often syncretic and very open-minded and inclusive views of Islam and other religions that are there as well.
Right, right. So when you were there recently, of course, I met you at the DNC convention in North Carolina just a few weeks back. You said you were working on some educational initiatives, or global education in particular.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that I try to do here in the United States is to encourage global education, which is different from international education. International education being sort of a vehicle for teaching children who are part of the global flow of individuals. Global education is where we begin thinking of ourselves as global citizens. We develop a global competence. We try to understand current events and history from multiple perspectives, and we try to remain open to many ways of being and seeing the world. And so a global education would prepare one for the kinds of diplomacy that is needed, but also the kinds of business and all kinds of artistic and literary engagement, and in a world that is obviously becoming rapidly interconnected, something that you've spoken of at some length. And so the idea is to sort of think about not just 21st century education, because we're well into the 21st century, but looking forward to 22nd century education. We perhaps find it difficult to anticipate the needs of the 22nd century, but we certainly do know that the world isn't going to become less globalized, in the sense that the flows of human idea and the exchange is becoming so much easier and will only increase, and we will only become more interdependent and more, I hope, interested in communicating with one another effectively and cooperating peacefully.
Right. Now, your mother, I know, for a fact, was doing international education, because she was working for women's literacy, women's education in Java, Yogyakarta, and in rural Indonesia in particular, right? And I think you're making an important distinction here, which is that international education obviously has had a particular focus in the previous century, and now we're entering a new era of globalization where, communities, people, cultures are coming together unlike ever before, and we have to have this global competence to understand people, to understand different backgrounds, languages, cultures, cuisine, music, right? Hawaii, of course, is the perfect place in some ways for this fusion, right, to take place.
It is. We are full of hybrids here, and people who sort of have many worlds intersecting in their own bodies. But of course, we have, in addition to the fact that so many people are mixed here, we do also recognize our position just geographically between worlds, between Asia and the United States. And we really want to take advantage of that position. I'm using the word take advantage, the phrase take advantage of, in the most positive way, in terms of thinking about how we can help to build bridges and to bring people together and to also begin to harness the ideas that will lead to greater tolerance.
Right, and of course, East-West Center, where you're still affiliated, was 50 or so years ago, approximately I think 50 years ago, 1959, was set up partly for this express purpose of
Precise.
bringing cultures, people, languages, policies, diplomats together. Isn't that right?
That's right, and it's becoming only increasingly valuable and important, and I think that we need to support organizations like the East-West Center, and there are other such organizations, but this is something that I think we don't realize that it is a mistake to ignore the rest of the world. And too often we think that America's power resides in continuing to sort of, show our muscle and
Right. Now, of course, Hawaii was colonized. There is a history of colonialism in Hawaii. There is a movie out there that talks about how Hawaii is all about oppression and how Punahou Academy has oppression studies in its curriculum, which I never found any evidence of that when I did my research at Punahou. Can you touch on this? I mean, was there anything about oppression studies as part of the curriculum at Punahou?
Not in my day, and not in my brother's. I think that, we are recognizing in many schools and with rigorous programs that we need to take a look at sort of post-colonial studies. And we, I think, need to recognize, not in a way that that diminishes the value of our coming together, and that, has us residing in the past, but in a very forward-looking way, recognize that that manifest destiny, and the sort of sovereignty movement, has a voice that that needs to be heard, and these are again issues that warrant respectful inquiry and sharing and dialogue, and so I think that the idea is not to begin thinking of ourselves as less powerful, but to begin thinking of ourselves as more complex, and to recognize the inherent complexities, and to recognize the hurt of history in such a way that will allow for conflict transformation and productive movement forward.
Okay, got it. Yeah, but what I found different compared to the mainland, at least in the historical research that I did. Of course, I only scratched the surface when I was there visiting you and Alice Dewey and several other people in Hawaii. That there was the history of Hawaii was that the native Hawaiians welcomed foreigners in. And that kind of abated the conflict, the level of sort of overt conflict that you would have seen among the natives, and the intermarriage rates in Hawaii have been significantly higher throughout its history.
That's what I mean when I say that we have a lot of hybrids here. I mean, the intermarriage rates have been extremely high and continue to be, and most people, if you ask of their ethnic background, you'll hear 4, 5, 6 different ethnicities: Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese, Filipino, Portuguese, and so forth. And that is, it means that identity is seen as something complex and multifaceted, and we don't think of identity in such sort of fixed, unyielding, bounded ways.
So even Portuguese? So the Portuguese, you mean from the travel, from the earlier days of...
The Portuguese were often Luna. They were the, sort of managers on the plantation. So, I mean, again, the idea is that there has been, because of the spirit of aloha, there has been less acrimony, less violence than you might think. That doesn't mean that there aren't people who feel a profound sense of injustice, and and that the takeover and the taking away of power, during Queen Liliuokalani's time
Right.
was, a lot of people think that that was a travesty. So I don't want to diminish their feelings. At the same time, I do think that Hawaii is by and large a successful model of togetherness, of cooperation, and that.
And multiculturalism. I mean, when we look forward, Hawaii in many ways is a successful model of multiculturalism. You know,
Exactly. Yes.
which if you go to Europe, they tell you multiculturalism has failed. It's had all these sort of.
Do they say that in Europe?
Oh yeah, well,
was
Angela
no-
Merkel said this. David Cameron agreed with her last year. Partly due to ethnic conflicts and so on and so forth. Whereas the United States and Hawaii, in some ways, represents a successful model of multiculturalism working effectively. So moving on, though, you also work on peace education, which is, I think, what you were kind of touching on briefly in your comments a little earlier, in terms of conflict resolution and working with students on peace education?
Peace education, what I try to do is to think about how we can already utilize the resources that we have. We can teach the classes that we're already teaching differently, and it doesn't necessarily require a lot of new investment. So for instance, I help teachers to teach social studies, like history, through things like structured academic controversy, which requires that they look at one side of a controversy, then debate the other side, flip their perspective, and then negotiate an agreement between the two sides. Or there's the doubting game and the believing game and the sharing game I've spoken of a lot, where you challenge a particular perspective, deconstruct it, detangle it, and then you uphold it as your own and defend it in the next breath, and then you share and find your own position drawing from both perspectives. So a lot of it is also recognizing that peace begins with us. It's looking at our choices as political participants, choosing to participate rather than being bystanders. It looks at the development of moral courage. It looks at empathy. We spend a lot of time learning about patience and persistence and what was required for any strong and effective nonviolent movement of change. We do peace gardens, and we look at our impact on the environment and look at alternative energies and our carbon footprint, and we think about how to make better choices in that regard. We also do conflict resolution, mediation training. We have a wide range of children's literature that we examine that models compassion and commitment and love in all forms, and we look at every major faith in the world and draw from each the powerful and compelling words for peace and against violence that are too often ignored. And we think about what would happen if the leaders of all of these religions were to make peace their priority and number one commitment to their followers. So the point being, without going on and on at further length, it's just that any peace education class is really about looking at conflict and peace in a multifaceted way. And it is not simply about conflict resolution, but it is about generating the habits of mind, the disposition, and the perspective that will be conducive towards peace and that will allow people to feel that it is in their own vested interest to stay in the room and to keep talking even when the conversation gets difficult, and where we learn how to communicate with one another in such ways that minimize anger and optimizes productivity, and that looks at our responsibility to ourselves, our community, families, and the rest of the world.
So to stay in the relationship despite conflict and tension, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So in an interview for my book, you provided an insight. I don't know if you remember this or not, but this was in 2009, I think, in Philadelphia, where I interviewed you at the AAA meeting at the launch of your mother's book. That big 500-600 page book that you have a preface to as well, which talks about your mother's work in Indonesia, where she spent 20 years researching artisan local villagers in 7, I think, different villages in Java and Yogyakarta. You said that your mother was inspired by the work of Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi, and I was taken aback by that, and I was curious to find out more. Do you remember what you told me? Because you gave me some very interesting insights about not only your mother, but also possibly your brother.
Yes, I mean, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I can say that our mother taught us to admire both men, and my brother admires their strength and their commitment and their accomplishments and their minds and their words, as do I. And I can say that for me, what makes them so compelling is this idea that something patient and seemingly soft and can be so strikingly powerful that we can accomplish enormous things without having any sharp points or jagged edges in our hands. And I think that that requires a lot of imagination, and it is that creative solution building that I would like to see more of in our nation's youth and in the youth around the world.
Right. So when President Obama came into office, he was asked, I think, in a high school in Virginia, if you were to have lunch with somebody, who would that person be? And he, interestingly, to my surprise, and I think to others as well in the room, he said, "Well, I would like to have lunch with Mahatma Gandhi."
Yeah.
But it would be a small lunch because he didn't eat that much. He was fasting a lot of the times.
Well,
so have you actually heard him say that around the dinner table when you guys were growing up?
Well, no, not around the dinner table that I can recall, but I mean, he was somebody that we always admired. I mean, again, I think that the admiration is, shared by many people, but it is about the fact that he was someone who wielded words well, who endured much and stood strong, and he was able to move mountains with just a gentle push of his hand. And I think that that is real power, and
Right.
it is. I think it's so compelling,
Right.
and I think that my brother understands that as president, you have to think about all of your constituency, and you have to be very pragmatic. But that doesn't mean that you take away your idealism and your strong sense of justice and your desire to have leadership serve the purpose of increasing social justice.
Right. No, clearly the president, and a lot of people have written this, that he's a pragmatist at his core, but he's also an idealist in the sense, of course, that you're speaking about, namely, to inspire to be the change that you want to see in the world, which is kind of, I guess, the social justice or Gandhian message that he does talk about fairly often and regularly. So now, briefly, in terms of the re-election of the first black president of the United States, as I talk about this in the book in detail, as the first multicultural president of the United States, the first president from the Pacific, the first president whose father was from Africa and mother was an anthropologist, had a PhD in cultural anthropology. I don't think this happened before. And for all of these reasons and other reasons that I won't go on here in this interview about, but the re-election of Barack Obama coming up now, and I think in approximately a month, how is, I understand that the energy level is very strong, and certainly you felt that at the convention, and it looks like he has a message that's really connecting with a majority of the population. Is that your sense as well, given you're active in the campaigning?
hope that his message is connecting with the majority of the population. I definitely think it was a successful convention. I was pleased with everyone's speeches and pleased by the energy and enthusiasm that was palpable in the convention center. I do think, and I said this at the convention, that there is a very clear difference in the vision between the two men and the two parties right now. And I feel that the Democratic Party is doing a far better job of thinking about things in an inclusive way and thinking about government as something that wants and is obligated to assist and to prop up and to inspire its people towards greater things. Whereas I think that the Romney platform is much more self-promoting platform. And what I mean by that is just that it is sort of about the kinds of success that and the pathways to success that Romney himself has enjoyed. It is about, in my view, a vision of government that is not particularly generous. And I trust that people will see that that the strength that comes from the American people, while it has a sort of rugged individualism at its core, it is also a strength that historically and currently requires that we work together, that we see each other as bound in purpose and in mutual obligation and responsibility to one another, and that has us kind of working together for the greater good. And
right.
I feel that our party did a good job of sort of elevating that vision. And I hope
and also I would say, you know, the DNC sort of strategy has been a little more effective in some ways than the other strategy, the competitive strategy, in terms of micro-targeting, whether it's women's cause or LGBT cause, or potentially going after the immigration issue and the ethnic, you know, blocks that are key and essential to winning any elections, you know, or the younger vote for that matter.
Yes. I mean, I think that you know, that basically my brother, this administration has been good for women. I think that it, you know, will continue to serve the needs of the LGBT community and the other populations that you mentioned. And I think the idea is to think about how we can maximize success for everyone and sort of have a much more expansive view of the American people and the American dream. So that is my hope. My hope is also that, you know, everyone continues to see the value of participating. And in this instance, that would be voting. But of course, I define participation broadly as, you know, by all means, you know, using your voice to share your story and to creatively brainstorm and develop solutions at the grassroots level as well as the governmental level.
Well, fantastic. So on that note, on that very optimistic and positive note, we have to end this interview. I want to thank our viewers. I want to thank Maya Soetoro-Ng for joining us, for giving us very precious time for this interview. So tune in next week to Asian Times TV for cutting-edge news analysis from the Asia-Pacific region. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.